Okay, first of all, I just want to thank you all for having me to speak at WordCamp Porto and allowing me to speak in English. My Portuguese is pretty bad, so that wouldn't go across too well. I've been living in Lisbon for a month, so it's been a great opportunity for me to see a bit more of Portugal and to meet some of the community here. I just want to start by apologising for my unpronounceable name. It works well in Ireland, Siobhan McKeown, people get it there. But in order to fit in better here, I'm happy to go with Anna, since it seems to be a theme among the speakers this weekend. So I am Anna McKeown. I work for Audrey Capital, which is Matt Mullenweg's other company, not Automatic. This means I have the immense privilege of being employed to work solely on the WordPress open source project. I work on managing the documentation. I organise WordCamps, like WordCamp Europe, which I organise with Zay, and we are all sporting our stylish t-shirts. I'm also working on a book about the history and development of WordPress. So I could talk to you today about how to write better documentation, I've done that before, or how to blog, or what it's like working on WordPress.org with people like Nathan and Otto all day. But it's 5 o'clock, it's getting towards the end of the day, so I think it's time for a story. Rather than looking at the nuts and bolts of WordPress, let's step back a moment. Back before the 3.7 release cycle, before MP6, custom post types, WordCamps, BuddyPress, WordPress.com, themes, plugins, and back even before WordPress itself. This morning, I'm going to tell you a story about an age. There will be some other stuff in there. There will be forks, freedom, maybe a little bit of controversy and a little bit of drama, and 1 or 2 puns. But back to the itch. There's nothing better than scratching an itch. I've probably got about 10 mosquito bites when I was in Lisbon, and they're horrible, but they're really nice to scratch. It feels really good. Like, ugh. But not all itches are physical, and in fact, if you hadn't guessed, this presentation isn't about physical itches at all. So if you were expecting a presentation about how WordPress developers were struck down by, fought with, and eventually, after 10 long years, overcame chickenpox, you're probably in the wrong place, and you can find the door over there. This is the story of a metaphorical itch. A metaphorical itch, it's a common term in the free software and open source communities. So many of you probably know exactly what I'm talking about. Scratching your own itch. It means to make a product that you want to use yourself, to solve your own problem. The author Eric Raymond, in his book, The Cathedral and the Bazaar, about open source development, says, every good work of software starts by scratching a developer's personal itch. So that gives you a little bit of context. And what I'm going to talk about now is the origin of the very specific WordPress itch. I'm going to introduce you to patient zero. It's not, as some of you might think, either of these guys, Mike Little or Matt Mullenweg. Nor, to find patient zero, we need to leave the United States, travel across the sea, go beyond the UK, go south to the Mediterranean, where we'll land on the French island of Corsica. Stuck to the side of a mountain in a small village called Servione. Here in a small apartment, above a noisy bar, lived patient zero. His name was Michel Vaudrigui. He was a developer, not long out of university, working in his first job at a development shop. He wanted to blog, like many people do. So he got himself set up with a piece of software called Blogger and started to write. Now, Michel was no Albert Camus. He wrote a lot about his cats, about his rubbish AOL connection, which I'm sure many of you have experienced long in the past, about technology. He shared links from around the internet, many of which are totally not safe for work, so I can't put them up here. And he complained quite a lot about his work and about his colleagues. In fact, sometimes it's kind of hard to understand what he's talking about at all. In late 2000, Michelle started to learn about PHP and MySQL with the forum software PHP BB. He dabbled around a bit with it at home. A few months later, his work switched servers and he was able to start using PHP as part of his job. He wrote on his blog, "I used to have my paws bathing in PHP only at home. Now my paws will bathe in it at the office too. I can't think of a better way to learn this language quickly." His love affair with PHP quickly grew. At work, he wrote a Corsican dictionary application with PHP and MySQL. It's still online today, and I think Michelle is a little embarrassed by it. But he got more and more engaged with PHP, and he fell more and more out of love with Blogger. Did any of you use Blogger back in the day when they were having server issues? Michelle had to use external comments. Twice the services he used went down, and he lost all of his comments. So he was getting itchy. And in June 2001, he started scratching in earnest. He wrote on his blog, "I started the development of B2, a PHP and MySQL alternative to Blogger and Grey Matter. There's not many new ideas in it, but it will feature stuff like a built-in comment system, good user management, user avatars, and multiple ways of archiving your blog. The installation will be easy. Just edit a config file, upload everything, and launch the install script. And there you go. Ooh la la." That's a direct quote. To soothe his itch, Michelle started out with the functionality that he wanted. He focused on functionality that got content quickly on the screen. B2 was supposed to provide a frictionless blogging experience. Michelle's early development focused on post editing and adding minor enhancements to make writing easier. He also looked into templating systems so that people could style B2 to make their website look like their own. As he did this, he had in mind a person he called Joe Newby, who he wanted to make things as simple as possible for. Michelle released the code, and other people started using it. Quite a lot of people, but for our purposes, 2 people really matter. In Stockport in the UK, Mike Little, and in Houston, Texas, Matt Mullenweg. On his blog, Mike wrote a lot about his family and the books that he read. Matt wrote about the web standards, his cat, and wrote an inordinate amount of puns. Both Mike and Matt had caught the blogging bug. And for both of them, B2 was the best tool for getting their content online. Matt had recently tried out Movable Type, which is the Perl blogging platform, which is the biggest around at the time. Did anyone use Movable Type? Anyone here? No? Did you have fun with it? No. Matt didn't either, so quickly he moved to B2. Written in PHP, B2 was easy for both Mike and Matt to hack on. Mike was an experienced developer with some PHP knowledge, while Matt had been using PHP BB for the forums of the website of his teacher, David Caceres. This is a Matt Mullenweg original design. I think you can agree it's absolutely delightful. With little experience in writing PHP himself, B2 was a learning experience for Michelle. In a WordCamp Paris presentation, he says, "When you look at WordPress's code and you think, whoa, that's weird, why did they do it that way?" Well, that's because they kept doing it the way things were done in B2, and I sucked at PHP. Lots of developers hated the code base because it reflected a developer who could just come up with an idea and find the quickest method possible to get it on the screen. But while it put off seasoned developers, it was great for novices. Early WordPress developer Alex King says, "In a way, it was beautiful because it was so simple. It wasn't elegant, but it was very straightforward and very accessible. For someone like me, who didn't have a lot of development experience coming in, it was very comfortable understanding what was going on." So a community grew around B2. Mike and Matt, under the usernames Mike Little and Illusion, you can probably guess which is which, helped out in the B2 forums. Mike became particularly known for helping people out with their hacks. A small but active open source community gathered around the software. But then development stopped. Michel lost his job at the development shop he worked at. It was shut down. He was depressed and had health problems. Things went from bad to worse. His electricity in his flat was cut off, and eventually he had to move out. Life, as it has a habit of doing, took over, and Michel backed off from the internet. In his absence was a hole. There's no one to develop and maintain V2, and without a maintainer, a quick piece of software quickly turns into vaporware. Worse, there weren't any equivalent options around. On his blog, Matt wrote a post bemoaning the situation, and buried in there is a suggestion to fork the project. Today, in the age of GitHub, we're all used to talks about forking, and it's quite easy to just fork a project. That makes it easy for us to forget that then it was considered a bad thing. It was only done in extreme circumstances, when there was a schism in the community, for example, or, as in the case of B2, the software became dormant. From across the sea in the UK, Mike Little responded, saying that if Matt was serious, he would work on a fork with him. They called their fork WordPress, and they used it to scratch their blogging itch. At that point, however, it was no longer just their own itch. There was a large B2 community that needed a piece of software. Once the first release of WordPress was out the door, more developers who were also bloggers, who were also writing about blogging and development and blogging tools, they came along to help out. The first developer to join the team was Donica O'Keefe. He'd already created a heavily modified B2 installation called B2++, which he used to create a multi-user blogging network for Linux users in Ireland. This eventually became WordPress MU, which was rolled into WordPress in 3.0 and became WordPress multi-site. The team was also joined by Dougal Campbell and Alex King, and later on, Ryan Boren. Eventually, Michel too got back involved with WordPress. In fact, WordPress powers his blog today. So development progressed, and it was important to make sure that anyone could scratch their itch, whether it was blogging or development. But first of all, primarily, the developers wanted to help people scratch their blogging itches, to help people to write online and share content. The blogging scene was exploding, and the self-hosted options were limited. The biggest platform in use was Movable Type, which, as they can attest, was awful, which was so difficult to install that consultancies and services were actually set up around installing it. You had to pay someone to install your blog for you. And what non-technical person is going to start a personal blog if they need to pay to get it started? Matt often says that he wants WordPress to be so easy that his mum could install it. And as an aside, I spoke to Matt's mum about this. I asked her a question and said that this is what he said. And she responded, "I find that insulting. It sounds like his mum is an idiot, when frankly, my IQ is higher than his." And it doesn't matter what. I'm always going to be older and smarter than him. What they came up with was the famous 5-minute install, which at that time was not very famous. The install script made it easy and fast for people to install WordPress. This has been refined over the years until you don't even have to open up WP config to add your database details. And many hosts just offer one-click installers so that it doesn't take you 5 minutes to install WordPress, it takes you 10 seconds. So the itch started to spread. More and more people from around the world were installing WordPress. Soon it emerged that it's not just English-speaking people who get itchy, which is, I'm sure you all know. In late 2003, a user called Otsukare created a fork of WordPress that he called WordPress Multilingual Edition. It was WordPress in Japanese. He posted about it on the WordPress support forums, encouraging other people to use his fork to create their own multilingual versions. This opened up a whole new question. WordPress wasn't localized, so it wasn't easy for people to translate it. There was the immediate possibility that forks could start springing up in lots of different languages all over the world. In a heroic effort, just before the release of WordPress 1.2, Ryan Bourne spent days wrapping every string in WordPress in the get text function. This let people from all over the world create translations of WordPress into their own language. The Japanese fork, though, actually lasted until 2008, and it was hugely popular in Japan. There was books written about it, and it persisted for a long time. It wasn't just bloggers who needed help scratching their itch. Developers needed help too. When you wanted to extend B2, you had to create a hack. You can still find references to hacks in the WordPress codex, buried in there. To make use of a hack, the website owner had to manually add the name of the file to the core menu text file and add the output to index.php, which is not a particularly elegant way of doing things. In WordPress 1.2, extending WordPress was transformed by the introduction of the plugin system. Hooks, called actions and filters, were placed throughout the code base. These are pieces of code that developers can use. They can hook in to run their own code at specific points. Filters, there was a small number of which were already in B2, let developers change content. Actions let developers run code when events are carried out. No more did developers have to bother Matt or Ryan about getting their own pet feature into core. If a developer had an itch, it wasn't necessary for everyone to scratch it. They could make a plugin, install it on their site, and if someone else had the same itch, they could share it with them. Unlike hacks, which involve messing with core files, plugins can be dropped into a directory in the WordPress install, making them easy to use for non-technical users as well. So developers could scratch their itch. Bloggers could scratch their itch. But what about designers? To style B2 and early versions of WordPress, a designer had to use just a CSS file. That's all they had to work with. There was no theme system to speak of. To encourage designers to build style sheets for WordPress, Alex King ran a competition. He wanted to create a version of CSS Zen Garden for WordPress. Does anyone remember CSS Zen Garden? Yeah, that was great. I think it's recently come back. There were floods of entries. They were all added to a style browser, and the very first winner was Pink Ladies by Naoko Takano, who's very much involved in the Japanese community. This is her theme, her CSS style sheet. But the developers still wanted to make it easier for people to build beautiful blogs with WordPress. In WordPress 1.5, after much hand-wringing about creating a templating system, they looked at Smarty templates, they looked at different systems, they ended up introducing the theme system that we know and love, making it easier than ever for people to have a well-designed website. So WordPress, it grew pretty steadily from the launch of the first version. But in mid-2004, something happened which saw a huge increase in the number of users. The most popular platform around, Movable Type, decided to change its license. They'd gone from a free platform to charging people for using the software, restricting the number of sites that people could use it on. So while people could still scratch their blogging itches, they couldn't scratch them as hard as they wanted. Their itch-scratching freedom became limited. The problem for Six Apart, the company behind Movable Type, was that every single one of their customers had a blog. They all had a platform to complain on. And complain they did. There were hundreds of posts complaining about Movable Type. Anil Dash, who was then at Six Apart, recalls now how he would go to all of these blog posts to personally respond to them. And on each one, there would be this kid called Matt saying, "You should move to WordPress." And move they did. You see, WordPress, unlike Movable Type, has a license called the GPL, which I'm sure many of you know about. That license says that users are free to do what they want with WordPress. You can use, distribute, modify, and distribute modifications of WordPress. Not only that, but the license cannot be changed. So the rules cannot be changed. all WordPress itches can and should be scratched. This wasn't the case for movable type. The developers could change the rules whenever they wanted, and they did. No more scratching. So the itch has changed and continued. The community has grown. More and more developers used WordPress to set up their blog and find themselves getting sucked more and more into the community. Designers and developers have built themes and plugins for themselves, which they then share. They enrich the ecosystem. Some people have even monetized these themes and plugins, and one or two make multi-million-dollar businesses off them. Many of these businesses continue to build plugins and themes themselves that they share with the world. Automatic's love affair with the P2 theme is just one example of how useful itch scratching can be. So, it hasn't all been easy, and I promised you a little bit of controversy and drama. There were times when people tried to game the itch, putting sponsored links into their themes and distributing them in the theme directory. You would have like a link sponsored by so-and-so for SEO purposes. This practice was eventually shut down. Some developers had a different type of itch, so they went to scratch it elsewhere. They built a blogging platform called Habari, which is still being developed today. But through it all, the itch has continued, and the itch of the few has become a tool in the blogging, writing, web publishing, web building, getting online itch scratching of the many. So if you have an itch, scratch it. See if there are other people around who have the same itch. Scratch it with them. Scratch it harder. Help other people to scratch it. Sooner or later, there'll be 10 or 20 or 100 or even 100 million people whose itch you will have scratched. Look at WordPress. 10 years later, we're still scratching. Thank you.
Hi. So, how do you see this story going on for the next few years? How do you see it in another 10 years? What would you expect? Would you say we can maybe come to a point where people will say, I want to build my WordPress instead of I want to build a website, for example?
I don't know, Matt I think it's quite keen for people to say, I want to build my WordPress. That kind of sounds weird to me. WordPress is a tool. We're using it to build websites, and the difficulty for us now is that, you know, we all have these or iPads, and kids growing up, they are way more adept with tablets than they are with laptops or PCs, and that's a real challenge that WordPress has to address, and I don't think it has addressed it yet. I think the mobile apps are a step in that direction, and it's good that we have the talent working on that. But, you know, I installed WordPress for my iPad. It was a horrible experience, and I wouldn't recommend it to anyone. Just using the admin on your iPad isn't great. So I think that's a real challenge that we will have to address. And in 10 years, I really hope we have addressed it, because we don't want to end up being obsolete.
Hi.
Hello.
You mentioned Habari, and in the last few months, I guess, there's been a lot of talk about Ghost. How do you see Ghost as an alternative, and why do people need something like Ghost in opposition to WordPress?
Good question. So Ghost, I backed Ghost on Kickstarter because it's a free software project, and I was really excited to see it happen. The biggest concern about Ghost is that it's written in Node, and I haven't installed it yet, but I've heard it's not that easy to get up and running. I would hope that WordPress can address the issues that people who are moving to Ghost are having. The attractiveness of something like Ghost or Medium, for example, is it just got such a nice writing interface. And I'm a writer. I want to write. When I write in WordPress, you would either will write in an IA writer, so not in WordPress at all, or I'll use the Zen writing mode. I think we could probably make improvements in that area. But people always want to try out the fanciest new tool. And the thing with Hibari was there was this huge, like, everybody was talking about Hibari, this new platform. Everyone was going to move to. It was just blogging, and it was about developers. And I spoke to the lead developer about a month or so ago, and he said they have about 7 users. So, well, I think time will tell what happens with Ghost.